reflect the situation of June N. And the most striking fact, if you look at the distribution of fatalities over different age range, is that in Italy there have been over 30,000 fatalities, but of these 30,000, less than 400, 317, are under the age of 50. So if you can see that this is the total share of total fatalities at the age of 50 is less than 1%. And you can see that the bulk of fatalities, in fact, about 67% of the fatalities happens in an age range between 70 and 89. So that is one very striking fact about the Italian data that can be generalized also to other experiences. And so we thought by seeing this data that there is an obvious policy, right? And the obvious policy is do not use an indiscriminate lockdown, but differentiate the activation of agents according to their working activity and above all to age. The main object of this exercise should be to protect older age that, as we have seen, are the most hardly hit bracket of the population. So the question we ask in this paper is, does it really work? And if it does, how much? So in order to answer the question, we simulate a model of the spread of the virus, and we want to specify a model that has a realistic feature. And so in order to check that the model has a realistic feature, we check the capability of the model of matching the data from two very different regions. And the two very different regions are Lombardia and Veneto. They are located very closely, and they are not different in terms of the structure of the population or the type of activity in the two regions. They are very different because of the fatalities that the virus caused in these two regions. In fact, as of today, Lombardia accounts for more than half of the Italian fatality. The total count stands at over 16,000, while in Veneto, there have been only 2,000 fatalities accumulated so far. And remember that the relative population, Lombardy has twice the population of Veneto, 10 million versus 5 million. And in order to explain this fact, you need to calibrate a model, to specify, calibrate and simulate a model that takes in account the fact that there are very different health systems, there are very different hospitalization rates, and these different hospitalization rates, which are controlled by policy, caused the different level of fatalities. So I won't go into detail of this now, but if there are questions, we have lots of interesting data to show about Veneto and Lombardy. The other feature that our model had, and it didn't have it in the first version, is that we look at two ways in which people change their behavior during the virus. The first is the obvious one, is in response to policy. Because of the high fatalities in Italy, a full lockdown was regulated and started on March 8th, which was then removed only partially on May 4th. So there is, of course, this kind of forcing the change in behavior, but we also allow for a behavioral response to news about fatalities by agents. Now, in this framework, what usually drives within a representative agent framework the diffusion of the virus, which is the so-called basic reproduction number, becomes a basic reproduction matrix in which we model different elements that are different because of the type of agents, the age and the type of work, and the type of interaction that occurs between agents. And to summarize our result, we simulate the model to study the trade-off of containment policies in terms of number of fatalities and GDP losses. And in particular, we designed 5 policy that goes from a full lockdown to indiscriminate opening to some intermediate policy in which the opening is partial, either by age or by working sector, differentiating working sector in high risk and low risk, or they can also, we do also consider a mixed policy by age and sector. And this is a final picture that summarizes our main results. These are the 2 trade-offs. So on the x-axis, we have the GDP loss over 1 year. So we simulate data for 1 year, starting from an hypothetical beginning day of phase 3 at the end of August 2020, and we look at the loss of GDP over the course of 1 year. This is the loss of GDP relative to a situation in which they all go back to work. So by construction policy, all will have a 0 loss in GDP. And here we have the cost in terms of fatalities of that policy, and that is the fatalities per million, which is, and so 5,000 here, because Lombardy has, so the red line is for Lombardy. Lombardy has 10 million population. 5,000 here, it means a total count of 50,000, while for Veneto, 4,000 here means 20,000. And then as you go down this line, which pins down all efficient policies, you see the effect of policy that are with respect to the all back to work policy, restricting some type of workers. And here we have the policy in which we look at age. We look at age and sector. There is also here a policy that looks at sectors only. It's not depicted because it's slightly inside the efficiency range. And here we have the full lockdown. And as you can see, the full lockdown minimizes the number of fatalities, but you can read here what's the cost of, in terms of GDP loss of the full lockdown. And the shape of this line is such that you can see that the partial opening, and opening in a way that takes into account how the spreading of the virus discriminates across age and working sector, is important to save lives and minimize the GDP loss. I think I've covered my 5 minutes.
Yeah, wonderful, Carlo. Well, thank you so much for this excellent summary of your study. And before I give the word to my colleague Akasemi, let me perhaps reach out to Andrea with a bit of a personal question. Andrea, if you could give us a little bit more background on how this study developed. Why did the 3 of you join forces? Where did the idea come from to do the study in this specific way? And also we would like to know how you personally were affected by the coronavirus, you, your family, your colleagues. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Andrea?
The study came about really from the observation of the first slide that Carlo showed. If you, Carlo, can go back to that, because this is really what struck me. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, my last son, I have 4 children. Mm-hmm. The youngest one was locked down with me. He's attending university in Turin, but he was locked down here because he was visiting at the moment of the lockdown. And it was already evident from the first, very first few days of the pandemic that there was this differentiation by age, that young people don't suffer because of the virus. And he said, actually, given that you asked this question, I mean, he really said, during World War I, World War II, a lot of young people were sent to die for a much less important reason. Here we risk nothing. Why don't they let us go out? Mm-hmm. And so I got interested in this idea, and I started studying this possibility of a policy that discriminates by age. and instead of closing down the entire economy, allows the economy to continue to work with those who risk less. At the same time, Carlo had a very interesting paper studying the effect of different hospitalization policies, and also hinting in that paper, preliminary paper, at the differential effect by age. And so we started to join forces with him and Aldo, with whom I already started to talk about this differentiation by age. We started by writing articles on newspapers, Corriere della Sera or Vox EU at the European level. And what struck us, what we find most striking, and actually would be very interesting to discuss this question with the audience of this seminar, is why nowhere in the world people are prepared to accept the idea of differentiate by age. Why there is such an opposition to a policies that to us seem totally obvious. Could be a constitutional requirement, but this is crazy because we differentiate by age many other policies in all countries: voting, retirement, political participation. So it's not clear why we do that. And yet in Italy, there was, when we first proposed this policy, there was a strong opposition to this kind of ideas. Although we are not the only one, to be honest. There are other economists who are proposing the same thing. Perhaps our paper is, of the paper we have seen that make this proposal, ours is the first one really based on data. So it's not only making the point that age may be a good idea, but also to grounding this idea into real data. But this is the question really that puzzles me. Why no country is doing this?
Yeah.
As for me, my lockdown was really a lucky one. I live in Tuscany in a nice house in the countryside. I could mountain bike in my garden. I didn't suffer much. My children suffered a little bit more, but as anybody else. So
yeah. Thank you so much, Andrea. And you do raise a very important question that perhaps later in the discussion we could revisit. But let me pass on to my colleague Akasemi, who also prepared a question for you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My question wants to really refer back to the sectoral implications of your research. And so, as I'm sure you know, certain sectors of the Italian economy are quite dependent on immigrant labor. And immigrants, they tend to be a more youthful demographic of the population. But yet I'm still wondering, what are the implications of your study for sectors such as textiles and Prato that are dependent on immigrant labor? Could you say a little bit about that?
I can clarify our general approach to sectors, and then Andrea may have something to add. So the way we classify sectors is by using an index which has been produced by the Bank of Italy in a study, in which they define a proximity index for each sector, and they relate risk to how close to each other are workers in these different sectors, right? So our idea is to relate our classification of different risk in different sectors to how concentrated is the mass of workers within each sectors. So just to give you, and of course, how risky is how risky is the contact. So if you think about the two extreme, you have on the one hand agriculture, in which the proximity is at its lowest, and on the other hand you have health, in which the proximity it's very high. And so the idea is to divide sector in high risk and low risk, depending on the proximity of workers in the sector. Then we also classify workers by age. And so within each sector, we know the share of workers that belong to an age range. And so if you see in our paper, we have 15 groups that are constructed by dividing the agents in working age in 5 age group that cover the range from 20 to 65, which is the retirement age in Italy. And then why do we have 15? Because we have 3 possible status. One is when the worker is active, and then when you are active, you can be active in a low risk sector or in a high risk sector. Then you can be inactive. And of course, if you are inactive, you're less risky for yourself and for the others, and that risk depends on your age, but of course you're not productive. So our classification of sectors look first at what's the average, what's the age range in each sector. Second, the riskiness is controlled by this proximity index, and this proximity index has a lot to do with the nature of the type of work that is conducted in that sector, and less with the type of people that are working in that sector. So in terms of our model, I have not the tools to answer directly to your question, but I think that your question gave me a good occasion of making clearer what's the approach that we take. Maybe Andrea has something to add to this.
No, just maybe that we don't have the data to answer, as Carlo said, but my guess is that immigrants are more likely to work in low-risk sector, like, for example, agriculture. So most of immigrants work in agriculture or in sectors that I guess would be included by the Bank of Italy in the low-risk part.
Andrea, let me perhaps follow up with a question specifically about tourism. Tourism is, of course, of high importance to the Italian economy. It's a question that definitely also is of interest to the American audience that is joining us for this discussion. Could you tell us a little bit more about the reopening of tourism in Italy? How is tourism being envisioned in a post-corona era in Italy? How do you see things evolving from your perspective, Andrea?
Well, the situation is really dramatic for tourism in Italy because differently than agriculture, tourism is in the high-risk sector. And therefore, it is very difficult to reopen tourism and avoid risks. In our original policy proposal, we suggested that our proposal of differentiating by age, those who go back to work and those who don't go back to work, an obvious problem of implementation is the need to isolate the old from the young, because if the young go to work and then come home and infect the old at home, that doesn't solve the problem. So we thought that one possibility would be to use all the hotels and tourist facilities that are vacant at the moment as a way to separate the two groups in the population for the time being. So maintaining the economy alive, but at the same time avoiding disconnection, which we think would have been difficult to implement, but better than closing down the entire economy. If the government had done this, it would have helped, because that would have been, of course, a subsidy to the tourist, which instead didn't have any revenue for 3 months. And as far as I can tell, very few tourists from abroad are planning to come to Italy in the next 3 months. And therefore, the situation is going to be difficult. It is true that Italians will probably not go abroad and or go less abroad. So there will be a little bit of a trade-off between Germans coming to the Adriatic Sea and Italians going to the Adriatic Sea. But the situation is certainly not easy. because this is a high-risk sector with a lot of interaction between young and old.
Yeah, but how do you see things evolving, Andrea, long term? How do you see things evolving? Do you expect dramatic changes in the way, if I come as an American tourist to Italy in perhaps 6 months from now, will I have the same experience as before? What changes do you envision, do you anticipate?
In our paper, we are very careful in making the point that we make predictions for 1 year, but it's very hard to make long-term prediction because we still don't know a lot about this virus. For example, we are still trying to understand an effect that we parameterize in our model with a parameter, but we don't know exactly what the value of the parameter is, which is the effect of meteorological of the weather.
Yeah.
I'm not a doctor, but doctors say that as this COVID-19, actually the SARS-CoV-2 is a virus, is a coronavirus, it loses aggressivity during the summer. Right. And in fact, there seems to be some evidence that it is acquiring power in the southern part of the world, which is now in winter, and losing aggressivity in the northern part, and in particular in Italy. So that would mean that if that were true and confirmed, we could be confident that during the summer we have a sort of a break. Yeah. But I would not put my hand on the fire for what will happen in December. Right. And this is why in our paper we try to present different scenarios. And I think the main lecture that I'm taking from this simulation exercise is that we are really on a razor edge. And it is very easy to fall deeply on one side, on the right side or on the bad side, depending on the behavior that people will take.
Yeah. Very good. Carlo, not sure if you want to add something before we go to the next question by Akasemi?
No, I think Andrea was very clear. I mean, one of the crucial thing when you simulate the effect of the virus is the probability with which, given a contact between an infected and a susceptible, the virus is transmitted, right? And if of course this can be affected by different things, right? For example, policies, people can wear masks and that reduces the probability, or the fact that the virus loses its strength with the humidity or weather conditions. At the moment, we see that probability has gone down. The question is it because of the mask, or is it because of the weather, or is it because of both? And there are not enough data to judge at the moment. But that is a very important source of uncertainty on the future evolution.
Yeah, thank you.
Having said that, I think for the summer, if you come to Italy, it's good. There is enough space to have a nice vacation.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. Kasemi, come back to you.
Yes. So before the coronavirus hit, Italy had reported the lowest labor force participation rates among working age women in the EU. And, in part, this had been attributed to the lack of access to public all-day childcare and schools. However, the lockdown closed schools and childcare centers, which were already struggling to meet the demand, pushing, many working parents and mothers into a difficult situation of how do they work from home and maintain their income when the shelter at home orders eliminated the childcare. So I'm wondering about the implications of your research and also the policy recommendations from your research for investments in all-day public childcares in schools, and also women's labor force participation in Italy. Do you see any important implications of your research for these questions?
Yes, there is. Our research has a very clear implication about schools. And then after that, I will say a word about female participation in Italy, which is also one of my field of research. So the implication of we were from the beginning very strongly against the fact that the Italian government didn't reopen schools. It was a really a big cost for society not to open school, because distance teaching is good for well-off families, affluent families, but it's terrible for families that don't have computers, don't have good web connections, do not have parents that can spend time with the kids in front of a computer. So it has increased inequality, and it has been very disruptive for families in which both parents had to work. So the obvious solution was again based on age. And still we think that this is the solution that the government should adopt from September 1. That is to say, all young professors go into the schools and open the schools with the children. All the professors older than 50 continues to teach from home, but with the children united in the classes in the schools, so that they can be assisted by the other teachers in listening to the lectures of the older professor when it is an older professor that teaches. This would allow those who are at low risk work in the normal way, preserving risk, avoiding risk for the teachers that are at higher risk. Keeping to account that one big problem of the Italian education system is that almost half of the Italian teachers are above 50. So this is why the government is so worried, the trade unions are so worried about reopening schools, okay? So our paper has precisely, and actually we could show you graphs of how this policy would work, and how it would be possible to reopen schools with a very low risk if the government were willing to do that. On whether female low participation in Italy, but that's not a COVID-related thing, depends on the availability of childcare. I don't know. My research doesn't suggest so. I mean, there are countries like the US to begin with that doesn't offer any childcare for free or government-based childcare, and yet female participation is much higher than in the US. The reason of low female participation in Italy are different. We can discuss them. I wrote a book about it. It's called L'Italia fatta in casa, Homemade Italy. But I don't know if we want to talk about this today.
Thank you, Andrea. Carlo, you want to follow up briefly?
Yes, just on the policy of reopening the school, of course, I fully agree with Andrea. I want just to add one small thing which is consistent with our model, which would be to fight an old habit of the Italian population, which is to send the grandparents to pick up grandchildren at school. That would be very dangerous, and we ruled that out in our reopening policy, because that would put in contact very high risk bracket of the population with the virus.
Mm-hmm. And one question I would like to ask is that when the discussion was going on coronavirus, the impact it had on the Italian economy, a topic that was often mentioned here in the United States was that somehow the mafia was trying to take advantage of the situation, and that intrigued me. I wondered if that was just a fantasy that, you know, American media likes to bring up the mafia when they speak about Italy, or is there some truth behind it, that somehow indeed the mafia was trying to make people more dependent on them, trying to take advantage of the coronavirus? Is there anything you have to say about that? Perhaps, Carlo?
So I think we have studied very carefully the data from Lombardy and Veneto. And may I remind you that Lombardy and Veneto count for more than half of the victims. And in the analysis of the data of Lombardy and Veneto, this issue was never raised. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's not one of the, of course, when you have to model, you have to simplify, right? And so this aspect was one of the aspects that we thought were not major or needed to be included in a realistic model for the data. So my answer to your question is, on the basis of what I study, I don't know, but I can replicate very well the data from Lombardy and Veneto and the differential spreading of the virus without having the mafia in the model. What is crucial to explain the different outcome for Lombardy and Veneto is the two different policies that the two regions have followed. So it's clear from the data that there is a problem with the hospital saturation. When you take too many people in the hospital, the quality of the care goes down and mortality goes up. And this is especially true when with a virus like this, in which unfortunately the share of people who require ICU support is much higher than in other cases. And so one of the main source of mortality is the fact that people going to the hospital, they need ICU, but they don't have ICU beds available, and so they do not survive. Now, the difference in policies between Lombardy and Veneto was that Veneto introduced an early testing. They took many more swabs than in Lombardy, and as a consequence of early testing, they could keep people quarantined at home. Now, what is interesting is that people are quarantined at home that start with mild symptoms. They keep their symptom mild, and they go along the infection with mild symptoms until they recover. If instead you don't detect people at early stage, you don't take care of them, they go into the hospital, they saturate the hospital, and mortality explodes. So and this is interesting because not only, what I think is interesting is not only the different approach to testing in the two regions, but the different approach in hospitalization. In Veneto, more than 80% of the early detected cases are taken at home. And what's interesting is that they stay at home. They don't need to go to the hospital. While in Lombardy at the beginning, 80% went into the hospital. Then I think that over time, Lombardy learned about the better policy in Veneto, and now the two policies have converged, and the rate of hospitalization in the two regions is about the same. So I think that if you want to focus on modeling and focus on main. Of course, we have to simplify when we model. I think that looking at this type of policy was much more important to explain the data than having endogenized potential influence by the mafia. So my answer to your question is, I don't know, but if I simulate my model without the mafia effect, I can still replicate the data.
Yeah, excellent. Andrea, anything you want to add to that?
Quite honestly, I don't think that mafia has anything to do with what we experienced.
Yeah.
As newspapers have nothing to, have to find ways to.
Yes.
Quite honestly, I don't see it also in the South. There is no evidence of that.
Right. Very good. Andrea, Akasemi, you want to follow up with a new question?
Absolutely. So my question is about the response to your policy recommendations. Have you seen any differences, for example, across political parties when it comes to the kinds of recommendations you're making that are sensitive to the age of different, to the age factor for the vulnerability of populations? Any differences among parties? And could you tell us why there might be differences or why there might be the same response?
Well, no, there was, I would say that the opposition is transversal. And actually, to be honest, an interesting thing that I observed during these 3 months of pandemic is that, particularly in March and April, party had somewhat disappeared. So while every day we are obsessed with what Salvini versus Di Maio versus Zingaretti, the political leaders say, for 2 or 3 months, they were never interviewed. They didn't intervene too much. And instead, the discussion was much more general. Opinion makers, people interviewed in TV shows and so on, was less like based on parties and more based on the society as a whole. So I think the opposition to our policy is interesting not because it raised different reactions by parties, but because it was really transversal. And what is most surprising is that it was coming also from the old, actually, in particular from the old people. There was a TV show in which this proposal was mentioned. I don't know. There is this philosopher Massimo Cacciari, who is a very famous opinion maker in Italy, and he strongly opposed this by saying that why should the old be discriminated and forced to stay at home? This is not constitutional, and so on and so forth. So, which is, to us is strange, again, because of the reason we already said, there is no need to repeat it. And it is a puzzle for us why so much opposition existed, not just from parties, but in the population itself. So probably we are out of touch with the population in our ivory tower, but we don't understand it.
Anything to add?
Two points which I think could be useful. The government appointed a committee to study the best possible reopening policies for phase 3. And in this committee, there is a very extensive mention of reopening by sectors, looking exactly at high risk versus low risk sectors. The report is 72 pages long. There is not a single word about reopening by age. The second, this is just, okay, that was, I think, a point. Now this is just a curiosity related to the political response. I think if you look at Veneto and Lombardia, we had a very different outcome, but the funny thing is that if you look at the composition of the government of the two regions, it's the same party who's dominating. So I think that the fact that which is the Northern League, that the Northern League in Veneto did do very well, while in Lombardy did very badly, convinced their leader to stay quiet, because of course it was a kind of a risky trade-off to put their neck out.
If I may follow up to those responses, both from Andrea and Carlo, I wonder if it had anything to do with hostility or resistance to experts and to expertise. That's something we've definitely seen in the United States when it comes to responses to social distancing measures, for example, as well as in some other national settings. Could you say anything about what the situation is like in Italy when it comes to the response to experts and expertise?
I will just give you a quick answer, then I'll leave the floor to Andrea, who's very competent to answer this question. My feeling is that, okay, I'm an economist. I have done a lot of work with the macroeconometric model, and I never worked before with the epidemiological model. What strikes me of the epidemiological model is how they sensitive are to parameters. And of course, then there is this thing. So the outcome is very sensitive to parameters. So if you think about the basic reproduction number, you change it by a little bit, and you end up with a very different outcome. Then the outcome typically is not measured in GDP loss, is measured in fatalities. And so, of course, that is a difficult issue. And I think that the public opinion reacts more strongly to 50,000 fatalities than to 3-4% GDP loss. But it's my understanding is that there is a potential of inherent strong sensitive to parameters, because models are nonlinear, and that happens with nonlinear model. And there is also the focus on the outcome, which usually it's measured in terms of fatality. So if you see a central bank model forecasting growth at 2.5%, and then growth come up to 4%, the reaction of the public is very different. If you see an epidemiological model forecasting first 100,000 victims, and then victims comes out twice as much as that.
Yeah.
But so coming back to the question of experts, actually related to what I was saying before, I think in the 3 months of the pandemic, we saw a different attitude in the Italian society as opposed to what was happening before. I don't know how much you know about the debate in Italy on vaccines, the no-vax. This is probably true also in other countries, but in Italy there has been a strong opposition to making vaccines compulsory. We're talking about pre-COVID world, no? There were people against vaccination of children, of babies. And that movement was based on an anti-expert idea. So we don't want to listen what scientists have to say about vaccine. We think that vaccine is a violation of our freedom. We don't want to do it. Don't tell us that it is important for our health, because it is not true. It is all some kind of pharmaceutical company that want us to do that, and those kind of things. As soon as COVID appeared, suddenly politicians disappeared from TV and experts came on TV. Now, the problem is that expert, partly because of what Carlo just said, we know very little about this virus, and these models are highly unstable. Many experts gave very different answers. And so we saw a kind of parabola during this period in which experts at the beginning had their moment of glory, and now they are sometimes under pressure because they talk too much or they don't agree. There are these conflicts between virologists and infectivologists and epidemiologists. They don't speak the same language, they don't say the same things. Those who think that mathematical models are useful, those who think that. And so, to some extent, maybe the experts have lost an occasion to show that people should count on them more. There were also, perhaps, I mean, it's easy to say it now, not so easy to say it in the moment of the crisis, but the experts hired by the government at the beginning were really giving different signals to the population. They didn't manage the announcement in the right way. Even the prime minister made some mistake of PR. So experts could have run the business better. But to some extent, I wouldn't classify these 3 months as a period in which experts were not considered. Every day on all newspapers, some epidemiologists or infectivologists or virologists or economists were speaking about the virus.
Yeah. Let me move on now to questions from the audience. And we have received quite some questions that relate what happened in Italy to the ongoing discussion now on the relief plan in the European Union. As you know, there is some disagreement within the European Union on the form in which this support should come. There is the suggestion by some that it should come with also a commitment to reform the Italian economy. There is discussion whether this relief should come in the form of a loan or in the form of a gift. And both of you are economists, right? So we would love to hear your opinion on what you think is needed at this point from the European Union, and what would really work to kind of give a new boost to the Italian economy. How do you see the current discussion that is going on in the EU? And perhaps we start with you, Andrea, and then we go to Carlo.
No, actually, let me give the floor first to Carlo, who's a macroeconomist, and he's much better equipped. I would say a couple of words at the end, but I think he knows more about these macro policies than me.
Very good, Carlo. Then we switch to you.
Yeah, thank you. So let me just start by saying that I have written one year ago with the two close friends, Alberto Alesina and Francesco Giavazzi, a book that is entitled Austerity. So I think that some concern about long-term consequences are in order here. First of all, our paper is not about the long run. Huh? So we look only at an horizon of 1 year in which, you know, unfortunately, we take a scenario in which the vaccine will not be available, and we don't look at the long-term consequences on macroeconomic and financial stabilities. However, so I'm not talking related to the model we have estimated. I'm talking from my general evaluation of the situation. Now, the situation in Italy, as you know, it's very serious because so now you can have a couple of scenarios, a scenario in which you have no second wave and a scenario in which you do have a second wave. If you have it in the baseline scenario in which you have no second wave, the ratio of public debt to GDP will be over in between 150 and 160%, 155, let's say. If we do have a second wave, and of course that will come with less growth, the projection now are for a debt to GDP ratio of over 170. And of course, this is a cause of concern. And I think it would be very important for the Italian authorities to say, okay, now it's not the time for austerity, for sure, because we need a fiscal intervention, which is expansionary to react to the crisis, but a plan on how, once the emergency we are over the emergency, a plan on how we plan to come back to and stabilize the debt to GDP ratio. Let me add that in terms of monetary policy, the monetary policy has given a great opportunity for stabilization to Italy. Why? Because when the debt to GDP is high, the risk is it's the rollover risk, right? But with the purchases planned by the ECB of government bonds that will be implemented by the Bank of Italy, by the end of 2021, it's true that the Italian debt to GDP will be over 150%, but it's also true that of these, 30% will be in the hand of the central bank, which means that the rollover risk would be comparable to a situation in which our debt to GDP ratio was 115, 120. So numbers are worrying, but not that worrying. What really matters, I think, it's that to give a clear response that we are aware of our public debt problem and we plan stabilization after the emergency is gone. Because the Italian debt has emerged because over 50 and more years, Italy has never used the right fiscal policy, in the sense that we have always done expansion of deficit while the economy required it. But then when the economy recovered, no stabilization was ever implemented. And the idea, I think, was to pass on future generation the cost of current policies. And I think it's very important that we go over that attitude and we give a strong signal that this is an opportunity for us to put our public finance in order, and we have a clear path on how we do that. And we haven't seen this yet because the stabilization plan published recently by the Minister of the Economy and Finance went just up to 2021, and so there is no stabilization there because, of course, the emergency it's still there. So I think it's very important to see how we will take a serious attitude towards fiscal stabilization.
Thank you so much, Carlo. Andrea, you wanted to add just a few words as well?
Just a few words to say that there has been a lot of discussion about whether what a northern person from Northern Europe should think about Italy, about lending money to Italy, about helping Italy, and so on and so forth. to be quite honest, for example, if you see what the Italian government did recently, so they spent 3 billion euro to save once again Alitalia, the Italian air company, who should have been closed 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. And we spent 15 million euros so far to save it over the year. And now they gave 3 more million to Alitalia, billion, and only 1.5 billion to school system. This is not a good sign, because education is what is important for growth, and Italy need to grow more because of the high debt to GDP ratio. And so this is a very bad sign. It's an indication of a government that is blackmailed by lobbies. Mm. And this leads me to my comment that the big problem of Italy are in the political system, in the fact that we have an electoral law that doesn't produce governments with a long horizon. And therefore governments are continuously subject to being blackmailed by different lobbies, whether Alitalia pilots or taxi drivers or whoever you want. And this is why they are never able to think in the long term that Carlo just mentioned as being the important one.
Yeah. Excellent. Akasemi, I will turn back to you.
Okay.
Final
again,
question, I think.
Yes, from the audience. This question is about differences in the outcomes across Italian regions. So if you could say something about how your research addresses the differences in outcomes in Lombardy versus Veneto when it comes that are in addition to the availability of ICU and testing, and anything that you could say as well about Southern Italy as well, the regions.
Well, the question of Southern Italy is, I think, one of the issues on which we still don't understand exactly how this virus is happening. And actually, it's not only a question of Italy, but also in many other countries of the world, we see differences across regions that are not so easy to explain. Part of it may be initial condition. So Lombardy was probably hit first when nobody knew anything about the virus, and this is why it exploded so much. One parameter that we didn't mention so far that might be relevant is population density. It is a parameter that in our model plays an important role in explaining the difference between Veneto and Lombardia, where Lombardia has a higher density than Veneto. And of course, for obvious reason, where there is more population density, contagion may be faster. Southern regions have, in general, a lower population density than regions like Lombardy. So that might explain it. The other explanation of the difference is simply that the meteorological one that was mentioned, that I mentioned before. So in the south, already in April and March, we also had a very mild April and March. So maybe the virus was less strong there already because of meteorological reasons. But certainly, I remember, everybody remembers at the beginning of March, people saying, look, Puglia or Sicily should be careful because what is happening now in Lombardy will get there in 3 weeks. It didn't happen. When there was the lockdown and then the reopening on May 4, southern region were almost willing to stop trains coming from the north to avoid the northern to come down and infect all the people from the south. There were big waves of people going back to their home. Nothing happened. So I think this is still one of the mysteries of our virus that we will have to study. For the moment, we want to speak about, our data are for Lombardy and Veneto, and the lessons we can take from these two regions that are valid for the rest of the world. And actually, we saw recently an article on the Wall Street Journal that were mentioning the same aspects also for the US. are that hospitalization matters and density matters.
Can I just add a small qualification, which might be important? I mean, one of the what I regard as most important contribution of economics to epidemiology is the fact that economists introduce behavior, right? So in basic epidemiological model, like the very famous SEER model now, there is this reproduction number, but this reproduction number is not affected by how people react, right? Now, of course, there is an obvious branch of economics which deal with this, which is matching theory, right? And one of the things that can reduce the basic reproduction number is the fact that when people see fatalities, they react differently, right? Now, it's an important question to measure how large is this effect, but if you think that there is some effect like this, that could be also an explanation. And in our model, we parameterize it, and we find an effect which strikes us as not huge, but I mean not negligible. And so there is now think back of the timing of the virus. The virus hit Lombardy first, right? For many reasons, but it's clear that Lombardy was 2 weeks ahead than the rest of Italy. Now, if there is this behavioral reaction to fatalities, of course, people in the South were, lucky enough to have the opportunity to react to fatalities in Lombardy. They did. And of course, the spreading of the virus was much more limited. In fact, one interesting thing is that you can simulate data from a model in which you have this behavioral reaction to fatalities and in which you don't have it. And if you do, the difference between the two models is that you will have sort of waves in the simulation of the model with behavioral reaction, because as soon as people see a lot of fatality, they become more careful and the virus is more contained. So of course, I'm not saying we didn't study the cases of other regions, so this is just a guess, but I think it would be consistent with our model that the timing of the virus with a behavioral response of individual to the observed fatalities in Lombardy. But it's not that fatalities were important per se, but it was the fact that every day in the news. So I mean, in February there was a news release at 6 o'clock every night on Italian television, and that was the hit of the day. Everybody was watching it very carefully, and of course, the first number that was given was the number of fatalities that day, and that I think might have affected behavior in other regions and might have helped the containment of the spreading of the virus. Yeah, and we have this effect in the model. We are debating on how strong it is, because of course, unfortunately, Andrea is a very good econometrician and has done wonders with the data, but of course the sample is very short, right? And there are many parameters to be estimated.
But still very, 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 very interesting. And I think we all learned a lot. 1 o'clock has passed though, so we'll have to conclude this event. I would like to thank my colleagues Julia and Akasemi. Would like to thank all of you in the audience for attending and for sending us your questions. But of course, a special thank you to Andrea and to Carlo. Congratulations with an excellent study, and a big thank you for making time for being here with us today and answering all our questions. So thank you so much and have a nice day. Thank you.
Great pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.